Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Dyrenfurth, and Redbridge's Kos Samaras. Each week, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations from the world of Australian and global politics, culture and ideas.
Good morning, Curtin listeners. This is the Curtin Cast episode, and I am obviously in Nick's position. This is Kos Samaras, and I'm joined by Shireen Morris, who's very much part of the John Curtin Research Centre, and the two of us will be conducting an interesting conversation today with none other than Stephen Parnis. Some of you who care to remember the pandemic would remember Steve fondly or not so fondly as one of the many voices that the media went to when we needed information from our medical professionals about what was going on from a health perspective. And I think Stephen was we could say, household name at the time. And many of us still remember his contribution to public health during that period. Today we'll be touching on issues that are sensitive to some of our listeners. So if you're a bit irky on issues around end-of-life conversation, you can switch off, or as Stephen's about to contribute,
you can talk to someone with expertise in the area.
Absolutely, right? And so that's the other very important point, that if you find these type of subject matter difficult to listen to, take Stephen's advice. Stephen, welcome.
Thanks very much,
And
Kos.
Shireen, welcome.
Thank you, Kos. It's awesome to be here with you.
Lovely. And Shireen's joined us from Sydney, because you used to be in Melbourne, didn't you, Shireen?
Yeah, I've gone back and forth between Melbourne and Sydney. I'm a Melbourne girl,
Yes.
so I grew up there. But yeah, moved to Sydney to take this job at Macquarie University in the law school.
Lovely.
Where I'm an associate professor, so I'm very excited to be joining you and interviewing you, Steve, as well.
Thanks very much, Shireen.
And we will be having a long conversation with Shireen around some of the work she's done professionally, and also for those of you who do know Shireen and her contribution to the causes associated with First Nations people, that will be very much the subject matter. Stephen, tell us a bit about your background. Where were you born?
I was born in Sunshine. It's in my passport.
Yes.
Very proud Westie. It was a series of cottages beside the railway line back in 1969, and it was no small irony when I went to what is now the modern-day Sunshine Hospital in Furlong Road. When I was a medical student, I worked for the local MP and got a tour as it was being built, and went and worked there as a young doctor, and it was my last training job actually too. So wonderful to do
Lovely.
that. Yeah.
Listeners who don't know much about Melbourne's geography, that's in the western suburbs of Melbourne. It's still very much what you will define. Those of us who've grown up in Melbourne still view that part of the world as traditional western suburban territory, so to speak.
Yeah, really amazing place from my perspective, a multicultural melting pot that's changed over the decades. When I was growing up in the 70s and early 80s, a lot of Southern Europeans, Maltese, Italians, Greeks, Croatians, and I'm sure I'm not respecting a number of other groups. The early days of the Vietnamese migration as well.
1970s, yep.
And people who had been there for many, many decades. Half my family worked for the biggest employer in town at the time, which was Massey Ferguson Agricultural Machinery,
Yes.
but way before that it was Sunshine Harvester, where which the suburb was named after. And, even though I'm a medical student, I love my history, and I got to know about the Higgins judgment and the importance of the need for basic conditions for people who worked for a living and earned a paycheck from week to week.
Where are your parents from?
Dad was the fully imported Maltese.
Yes.
He came here at the age of 18 in 1964
Right.
with one of his brothers, and then the other 7 or 8, along with my grandparents, came out not long after. Mum is an interesting mix. She was born in Sydney, of a Maltese father and an Anglo-Celtic grandmother who I never knew. She died in her 40s, unfortunately. Okay. So it's a real mix. I don't look particularly Maltese, but I can speak the language and, you know, again, part of hopefully the best of that culture that I can bring to being an Australian as well.
Lovely.
Steve, do you come from a medical family, or were you like one of the first to go and study medicine in your family?
I was the first to go to university.
Amazing, yeah.
Now, my father went through to the equivalent of Year 11, the O-levels. Malta was an English colony at the time. And back in the early 60s, there was full employment. It became apparent for him to just go straight into work. I know he would have been a wonderful university student. He never did it, but he doesn't regret that. And yet he and my grandmother, his mum, who never spent a day at school, who learnt to write her name at the age of 60, both strongly encouraged me. And I'm the first in the family to go to university, but I'm certainly not the last. We've got a couple of PhDs. We've got people across the professions, and, you know, that value of education is something that we're very proud of, and I know that a lot of migrant families share that story.
Do you remember your Year 12 class? How many of you went to university?
Oh, well, that was interesting because for me there was a huge culture shock around Year 9. I was at the local St John's College in Braybrook, and a lot of people I'd grown up with, but then won a scholarship to go to Xavier College.
Yes.
And, you know, to go from sunshine to Kew you almost needed a passport. That was a real learning experience for me. I think, you know, I've got 7 or 8 people from my year at school who went into medicine, some of whom are lifelong friends. Had dinner with one last night. But just that was a good thing, because I think apart from that, the importance of the Jesuit influence, go for excellence, don't take a backwards step if you believe you're doing the right thing. It also said to me that my horizons extended beyond the Maribyrnong River. That I could mix it with anyone. And that was really important to me because I really didn't have a frame of reference otherwise. And, you know, the medical figures I knew was the family doctor. That was it. So a lot of unknowns as I went through my teens, but I have no regrets about that.
Growing up in the West, you know, can be, particularly during the 70s and 80s, you do get a sense that the world is very small, and crossing a river to the other part of Melbourne.
Yeah.
You know, you get that sort of, I wouldn't say culture shock, but definitely just have this view that you are confined to a particular geography. And that's an interesting mindset that you just touched on. You know,
yeah, not just the geography. I suspect there was a degree of inferiority in that complex as well. I remember arguing in a administrative tribunal, a planning case where some developers wanted to really overdevelop land next to my grandmother's house, and the condescension of the tribunal member and the planning lawyers. So I really went after them, and we got a few concessions out of them, but just that idea of people looking down their noses at areas that in some ways might not be looking particularly pretty. I mean, Sunshine is a flat floodplain.
Yes, it is.
But, you know, it was home. It was my village. It was my people. And the sense of community, of generosity and support that I had, I couldn't do what I do without that love and support. And so I was going to protect them come hell or high water.
Formed your politics.
Did you want to, was that a driving force for you, Steve? Like, you know, you obviously wanted to fight for your community who you could see were disadvantaged, but was there an element of, I want to prove people wrong here as well, defy some of those expectations?
Look, a little bit of that, but I think I've always been interested in what I regarded as the things that matter, probably at the expense of not having as much of a sense of humour or fun as I should have, but I really felt that and I still do feel that incredible obligation to give back to those who've given to me, to really fight against injustice as I see it, because there are too many people who are taken advantage of. And, you know, I think that the word vulnerability is one that keeps coming up in my view on life. And I think that seeing people achieve just outcomes, find contentment, find opportunity to be their best selves, that's the sort of thing that I've always been interested in. And my influences have always sort of pushed that. I mean, I've learned over the years that you can't generalise about people. There were some people I went to school with on the other side of town who did not have a judgmental bone in their body, who were celebrating my success as much as I was, who were so generous, and I consider them lifelong friends.
That's awesome. So clearly, you know, that early part of your life shaped your politics. And you've gone to university, obviously, and you started that journey. Did you get involved politically?
Interestingly, I got involved in the local Labor Party in Sunshine.
Right, yep.
Joined it was called the Ardea branch.
Yes.
One of my uncles was secretary of that branch. He later became the mayor of Sunshine.
Right.
I really didn't get involved in the Labor Club or other political things within the university until my fifth year, because back then medicine was a 6-year undergraduate degree. And before the fifth year, I was approached by a couple of people from the Labor Club to see if they could get the medical student vote, because we were a big group. We did everything together, so it was a fairly easy group to organise, and if you could make a case, you'd get a big vote. But it was very apparent to me that the medical students voting for an organised political party was just not going to happen. But that planted the seed in my mind that the medical students could vote and have a significant influence. And I and almost the second person got elected to student council. We had the view of trying to get some of the money that we paid in those services fees back to us, because for more than half of your medical degree, you are not at the university, you're in the hospitals and elsewhere. Yes. And that money can make an enormous difference when you're living in the country on, you know, almost bread and water trying to study at the hospital. We achieved that, but then we were sort of caught in the middle of all of this turbulence. That year the student union president got sacked, and I was the temporary leader of the student union, and that was a baptism of fire, but it was actually my best year academically as well, ironically. So, you know, my membership of an interest in politics, which, while it started as a kid, really sort of probably took off from my 18th birthday onwards, and I've always been passionate and interested in those things, and you know, not your typical centre-left political aficionado, because I did medicine, and some people think that medicine is very detached or above politics, but nothing could be further from the truth, to be honest.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind actually, you know, the three of us exploring that. You know, the overlap between, I would say, class politics and medicine, and how the two are actually incredibly connected, and how I would say our society tends to try to avoid having frank conversations around that connection.
Well, there's a person who's famous in medical circles, an Austrian named Rudolf Virchow. He's called the father of modern pathology. He lived in Vienna in the mid-19th century. He was actually a member of the Parliament of the Habsburg Empire, and he made a quote which I hope I paraphrase this faithfully, but he says, "Medicine is a social science and politics is medicine wrought on a big stage," which speaks a great deal, I think, that you're talking about people, you're talking about their welfare, and you cannot restrict that to basic biomedical science. And there are countless examples across history where a doctor to do the right thing medically does something political. And a good example was a guy named John Snow, who was a doctor in London in around the same time, actually, the 1850s, who took the handle off a water pump in an area in London, and that stopped a cholera outbreak, which was killing a lot of people in those days. Now, that was a political act, but it saved a lot of people and established beyond really any doubt that the bacteria that causes cholera was to be found in water, and it emphasised the need to separate water supply from sewage and drainage. And those small lessons, when adapted around the world, have made a difference to the lives of countless millions.
Interesting. I would argue that as a society, we now apply too much emphasis on medicine being completely detached from socioeconomic political issues. And I would argue that the two are absolutely connected.
They have to be, and I saw a really good example. We'll remember this from the last couple of years. There was an American emergency physician who lamented the American gun culture. The rates of mortality over there are just so far beyond any other Western democracy. The highest cause of death from the ages of 15 to 24, I think. And someone told her to stay in her lane. Now, American emergency physicians, even the most junior trainee over there, sees more gunshot wounds in a week than I have seen in my entire career. And there are cultural, historical differences, but one of the big differences in our lifetime was the national reaction led by the Howard government to really curtail access to firearms. It's not perfect, nothing ever is, but that's an example of where prevention's better than cure. The best trauma I treat is the one that I never have to treat. So you try and prevent before you have to mitigate.
It's definitely one Conservative Prime Minister that I would say saved thousands upon thousands of lives, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is that example that you make a change, you can affect the lives of potentially millions.
Absolutely.
So, Steve, I want to know, why emergency? Why emergency medicine? Were you tossing up between different specialisations, and what was it that drew you to? And just to getting back to that, the class thing that you raised, and whether or not Kos doctors should be insulated from, issues of class. I just got in the back of my mind, did you study medicine pre-HEX?
I was in the middle of it. So in my first 2 years, there was this administration fee of $250. I remember wearing a badge saying thin edge of the wedge. And then from my third year, so I had 4 undergraduate years where I had the HEX fee. And I had a debt of about $8,000, which sounds like not very much these days. It felt like a fair bit as a student, but with the hours I worked as a young doctor, I paid that off pretty quickly. And I compare it to the debts that my kids have, and it's pretty significant. But no, I saw the beginnings of that, absolutely. You asked about emergency. It wasn't my first pick. It took me some years to work out where I wanted to be, and I actually went a long way down the path of becoming a surgeon, to the extent of really being about 2.5 years from finishing. But I found that the hours, the culture, the bullying, the people actually I don't want to overgeneralise. There are some wonderful surgeons who are lifelong friends, but I thought I cannot be like this. And so I moved from surgery to emergency and found a natural home. And there were some people there who, again, I thought, I really want to be like this. There was one bloke I remember who would walk down Swanston Street. I was with him once, and he knew the names of half the homeless people. And they knew him and they loved him. Andrew Dent was his name. He died too young. But he's responsible for a lot of us becoming emergency physicians. The other thing was that emergency, you could get in, you could work incredibly hard, and then you could get out. And over the subsequent years, particularly when my role in the AMA moved up to state and then national leadership, I could pull back from the hospital stuff so that I could give more time to the political work. And interestingly, the surgical stuff really put a bee in my bonnet about some aspects of medical culture, and I was able to do something about some of those things in AMA leadership roles.
Fascinating. So politics and medicine, those of us who do follow politics, particularly in the state of Victoria, you were quite a prominent figure when the euthanasia laws were being debated here in Victoria.
Yeah.
Walk us through your perspective. I mean, you opposed those laws, and you and I have had long conversations around why you did that and the complex moral space. But I wouldn't mind you also touching on the work you've done. You can't be a doctor in your position and not have come across hundreds upon hundreds of people that have passed away in your presence.
Yeah. It's complex, and this is one that touches us all because whether we like it or not, we will face the end of our lives, and also
we've all got that ticket.
Exactly. And people who we care deeply about will go through that stuff as well. And my sense was that as an AMA leader, I wanted us as a society to become better at looking at and dealing with end of life, because my sense was that over maybe a couple of generations, our society had become progressively more quarantined from death. And because of that, less well-versed in thinking through those issues about what it means to live well until you die, what a good death looks like. And completely understandably, I know why people don't want to talk about that stuff, or when they do, they really want to try and deal with it as quickly as they can to get it out of their consciousness. So things like advanced care directives, which is the equivalent of a will, saying these are the things that matter to me at the end of my life. Trying to encourage the profession, healthcare, hospitals, ambulances, to have good information so that you don't instinctively throw everything at a person when sometimes good pain relief, holding their hand and caring and helping someone realise they're not alone, sometimes that's all they need. And judging those things is not easy, but goodness me, it's rewarding. Anyway, fast forward, there has been pressure in society for decades for access to the ability to take one's own life when one felt that was the right time. And I'd known a number of good people, medical colleagues who felt incredibly strongly about those things and were prepared to push the law to achieve that. I sat around health policy forums in the Labor Party with some colleagues. The late Rodney Syme is an example. I didn't agree with him on this, but I respected him and I think he respected me. Anyway, the way things go, this complex area got oversimplified to my mind, where it was presented as a number of things that I disagree with. This idea that there were so many deaths that are horrific and will never be solved without this panacea of a lethal medication. The idea that people have a right that they have to exercise, that you can do this perfectly safely. That is the biggest one that I have a problem with. I don't think you can make this safe, and I base that on my decades of experience in the medical profession. Some of it, and I'll just give a few examples, I have seen too many people, and it's heartbreaking, where they are frail, they are nearing the end of their life and they are alone. Either they don't have a family, they're abandoned by their family, they don't understand the health system, they don't have access to the sort of care that they deserve. And so they're either very poorly diagnosed, they're not given access to the right medications or treatments that they should have. They don't get the right diagnoses. People often have undiagnosed depression. They don't have access to the people who can say, gee, we can do this, this and this for you, and it transforms their lives. Knowing so-called safety mechanisms and, again, studying systems and risk and how bad outcomes occur from a whole number of problems lining up, these are all things that are part of being an emergency physician, that's for sure. And when I see people in Parliament saying, we've got 65 safety mechanisms, it can't go wrong. I scoff at that sort of nonsense. And so I think there were better ways, and there still are. You know, palliative care is not understood by half the medical profession, let alone the wider community. We refer people far too late. Palliative care might involve someone spending more time on the golf course. You know, it's not about closing the curtains, dimming the lights.
Explain that to us a bit. I mean, this is important, right?
Yeah.
And I think that part of the problem we have as a society, and it causes all sorts of problems that are kicked on as a result of this, our inability to talk about that end.
Yeah.
Palliative care on the golf course.
Okay.
Yeah.
You can have a condition that is not curable. And so the aims of care are about control of it, about symptom relief. I'll give you an example. My father-in-law, who's now living with us, he's got metastatic colorectal cancer. He's been living with that diagnosis for 5.5 years. He moved from Queensland to Tasmania 4.5 years ago. So living his best life, having 3 weekly injections, and it's starting to progress now. But that's all been palliative. And yet until about 3 months ago, he was going on road tours around Australia, building things around the house, giving his sons-in-law grief. His political views are a little bit more conservative than mine. God love him. But that's what palliative care is about. And again, early preparation really matters here. Now, you've got to have enough people with the expertise. You've got to have enough awareness of these things, and people are empowered with that information. We're often not giving it to them. I think that the regulatory oversights are really more like tick box exercises rather than real scrutiny for these things. So maybe that's one where my idealism about society has been tempered, and I say I worry, because if you get this wrong, it's a wrongful death. And I think that there are better ways that people can die than too early often, I think, the suggestion that, here's something that'll take your pain away. I'm very happy for pain to be taken away, but you don't have to have your life taken in the same process.
Steve, do you think the risk of people slipping through the cracks, as you see it in the current system in Victoria, is that risk particularly acute for certain groups more than others?
I think so.
Could you explain why? What groups are we talking about here?
People who have English as a second language, people who are impoverished, people who have been, who are socially isolated, I think. So the lower incomes, the people who live the furthest away from the central business district, because again, we know that one of the principal markers of health outcome is your distance from the capital city. The mentally ill, all of those people who I class as vulnerable. And again, to those people who think, I'm in those powerful echelons of society, I'll always have my way, I can tell you that when you get a fatal diagnosis, you become vulnerable. And that is where it is so important to have people who are committed to you and your best interests, not anything else. And I'm proud to say that 99% of my profession is like that.
Yeah. So what added reforms or guardrails or, additional safety valve mechanisms would you be putting in there to stop the risks that you're pointing out? How would you address that?
I'm trying to push back against this urge to widen eligibility at the moment, because I said back in 2017 that things that are called safeguards today will be called obstacles tomorrow. And that is coming to pass, this idea that you don't have to be a doctor to be one of the health professionals. And the complexity of diagnosis, I struggle with that after 33 years as a doctor. But having people who go on weekend courses who are not doctors who then say, oh, yeah, we're capable of making these decisions, I'm sorry, that is disrespectful to the complexity of the process. Things like WA has the opportunity for these consultations to happen over a video screen. I understand the tyranny of distance, but I also know that you lose something when you are doing something over a video screen or over a phone. And when you're involved in this as a doctor, you really need to be looking for every subtle clue that this might not be the way that the person is wanting to go. They're often surrounded by family. You wonder if there are levels of coercion. I'm not talking the overt stuff. That's criminal. I'm talking about the really subtle stuff. And diseases as well that your class is eligible. You know, we've said in Victoria you've got to be above 18. There are people and jurisdictions around the world where kids are allowed to participate in this. Do we want that? And what about something like dementia or diminished capacity to make these decisions? Who wants to be the one making the decision that when someone reaches a certain level of dementia that's the time for them to be given a lethal substance? I tell you what, it's a horrific concept that, as I think of it, knowing and having treated thousands of people with dementia. And interestingly, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare have just put out a report saying that dementia is now the number one cause of death in this country.
Yes, it is, yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
So they're just some of the examples. But, you know, when we hear the word dignity bandied about without qualification of what that really means, that's what worries me. Mm. And the debate is oversimplified, and at worst it becomes a personal attack.
If you look at the campaign that was run to get these laws up and running,
yeah,
do you think there's a class element to it? I mean,
yes, I do.
Do you get much?
I do.
I mean, I can probably answer this question myself because I've looked into this as well, and Shireen, I'll be interested in your thoughts here as well. But no one from the community I grew up in was knocking those doors down, asking for euthanasia laws.
Yeah.
Their concern was more around the loss of agency when they got old, that they saw their parents back in the homeland enjoyed.
Yeah.
Now, we're not going to don on the rose-coloured glasses here. We all know that everything's difficult in the old world, but there was a level of dignity that was given to an old person when they were reaching the end.
Yes.
And when I speak to people in these communities, their response to these laws is, well, I mean, they're obviously religious, but their response to it is, oh, look, that's a bit too simple.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, right? They have no medical background at all, and the immediate response to it was, it's a bit too simple. These things could take some time.
Yeah.
As in you could take a while to die.
I agree. I think if we all had tertiary degrees, if we all had that real empowerment that we got and did what we wanted through the course of our life, everyone would want these laws. And in some ways, the law would be irrelevant. People would do what they wanted to do and get what they wanted. I used the example of the retired academic who at the age of 104 flew to Switzerland maybe 10 years ago to end his life. And I can't remember the circumstances in which he wanted to end it. But again, there are people who say, why do I need to have a disease or a diagnosis in order to be eligible to do this? My patient populations are largely in the group that you talked about, Kos. I've worked in the west of Melbourne. I've worked in the inner suburbs where there's a high amount of addiction, homelessness. They're not the movers and shakers of society, and I think for them it's they know about powerlessness. Actually, all they want is to be loved and cared for and respected and have their symptoms eased. So I agree, that notion of who has power, and so much of what I do as a doctor and my colleagues as well is to give information to people because that's empowerment, and sometimes that is the best thing that you can do for someone's well-being. Say, these are your choices. Give it some time. Let's have a think about it. It's what you want. It's not what I'm what I'm saying you must have. You know, as a doctor, I've got enormous power, but I must temper that power by ethics, and those ethics say respect for the patient's autonomy and do good, not do harm. It's really hard to see how killing them is not doing them harm.
That's really interesting, because what's been in the back of my mind listening to you talk, the way you talk about this issue is very practical, right? But very focused in on how do you make it work in practice. So I'm just interested in, and also Kos, you mentioned how some communities, perhaps where education levels are lower, more working class type communities, is there an intersection here between religiosity, religious beliefs in those communities? Is that part of the reason that they are ethically perhaps less predisposed to this? And I'm interested for you, Steve, as well, and for our listeners as well, like on this thing of ethics, like I get that it's a minefield, grey area, and getting the legislation right is very, very difficult. I can see that. To what extent to some of these fundamental principles about what is the role of a doctor, do no harm, prolong life rather than end it, to what extent is that kind of thing playing a role in your position? But also, is there any religious element for you in there as well, or is it all practical?
Oh, no, I think, and I will use religion and culture because they are so intertwined, I think. For me, I'm Catholic, and those values inform the way I view the world, but, I'm married to a non-Catholic. I lovingly call her a heathen. She's Scottish.
A fine member of that club, I say.
I'm outside of kicking distance when I say that. But look, what I strongly resist is this idea that we put labels on people because they can be oversimplified. So often during the heat, and it was a white-hot debate in Victoria in 2017, there was this idea, let's just call him a Catholic. That explains everything. That's the end of the debate. Right. We've won. I mean, that's bullshit. And, I remember being profoundly disappointed when my former colleague who was leader of the AMA tried that one on a debate we had on Radio National. I remember Patricia Carvelis looking aghast when that one was raised. But anyway, I think culture, religion, these are ways in which traditionally people have viewed existential questions, and end-of-life policy is an existential question for all of us. So, I think we're in a very pluralistic society. I'm the strongest defender of the separation of church and state, and I think that whatever perspective that people bring to this, it's important and it needs to be respected because it's a way to look at something where, as I said, for the last 2 generations, I think we've moved away from thinking about this at our cost. So for me, it's not about the prolongation of life at all costs, never has been. I'm very happy for someone to have an accelerated path to death if that's the only way that their symptoms can be relieved. That's absolutely fine. But the way that people interpret suffering, pain, care, these are things that really matter and that I can help people come to terms with. And you don't have to be on the same cultural or religious page to do that. And I actually resent it when religion is used as a way to divide people. I had a Greek mate the other day trying to raise the Eastern Schism from 1054 as a way of sort of saying why Catholics are apostates and things like that. And I said, mate, let's not worry about that sort of rubbish. Let's think about what really matters today. Yeah. And we've got so much in common, like protection of the vulnerable. So that's why I think we've got room to continue to move with this one. And I think having a robust regulatory system that looks for problems and identifies them and deals with them, that's something that we need to move towards, because I'm worried that the regulatory boards are just cheerleaders at the moment.
I remember, was it conducting an interview with you, or was it a podcast? Can't remember. number of years ago on this very subject, and I obviously am an atheist and came from a class perspective, my reservations about it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't necessarily that poorer people are going to be exploited and pushed off the cliff or forced into euthanizing themselves when they shouldn't be. It was more actually, I couldn't quite define it in my own head, but I think you've captured it perfectly, which is about that the level of disempowerment people feel when they are given that news and they are experiencing it physically is different depending on your status in society. Would that be a fair point?
I agree. I remember a case of one of the many people I was looking after in the worst of the pandemic. You know, I worked at Werribee Mercy for those years, and Werribee was the worst hit hospital in the country.
Yes, we want to talk about that, by the way.
Yeah, but just in this context, you know, this was at a time when you couldn't have people, the family in the room. It was horrific stuff because we didn't know whether they'd get the virus and they'd be at risk of dying themselves. And I'm shielded up like Ned Kelly. But I'm holding the hand of this person who is old, frail, got COVID. Their oxygen saturations are just, you know, you have nightmares looking at the screen and you know they're dying. And what I do is you look at them, you get close to them so that, and you hold their hand. Sorry. But you know, that was a huge responsibility because I was taking the place of family. But also what a privilege, you know, because something as simple as saying another human being who knows what they're doing, cares about you and is going to keep you safe until the end. That's the essence of what I and many of my colleagues do, and I want to protect them. And if I can't do that, then I'm not going to be a doctor.
It's obviously a very traumatic period as well, wasn't it, the pandemic?
For a lot of us, well, you know, I mean.
For everyone, but I think it's commonly not really touched on by those of us who weren't in the medical profession. Who clearly, you know, those who were at the pointy end of the spear, like yourself.
Yeah. It's interesting. I suspect it's the closest I'll ever experience to going off to war.
PTSD and all that.
Yeah, I needed 3 months off in early 2022 because I was burnt out. And I did it to myself. I worked at 3 hospitals, did all that media, speaking to colleagues in government and across the health system to try and help with policy, because a lot of this stuff we were doing the best we could with the limited of information available. And it was exhausting. But, you know, there was a real pride in saying my skill set is what society needs at the moment. And not just in terms of medical care, but communicating these things. And it was exciting, but it was also exhausting as well. And that will probably be the most pivotal moment in my career, I suspect. But you're right. Well, I think we all paid a price for that. But I think generally as far as doctors and healthcare workers go, we're proud of what we did. We put ourselves at risk because we didn't know how infectious it was. Turned out to be much more infectious than we thought it was. We knew that the mortality rates were at least 10 times what they were for influenza.
Especially the early variants.
Exactly.
Yes, that's right.
Exactly. We didn't have any immediate treatment for it. It was about prevention and what we call supportive care, not antivirals, not the vaccinations. So it was scary stuff, but you haven't got the luxury of waiting for all of that information to come in before you start treating. And so did we make all the decisions right as a profession or as governments? No, we didn't. But when we saw what was happening to other advanced health systems like Bergamo in northern Italy or New York City.
Completely flattened. Yeah.
You know, where they've got mass burials, where they've got people short of oxygen outside a hospital because they haven't got the facilities to treat them. I mean, that was stuff that made me literally wake up in a cold sweat. And, you know, we got through it. But again, people don't thank you for the things that you've averted. And there are some who cannot look beyond their own immediate circumstance. The sacrifices particularly, let's say, in Melbourne, with isolation, with kids not being able to get to school, with the risk of unemployment, of social isolation, of addiction, all of these things, they're huge, and we're still coming to terms with it. But so often in medical care, it's about the lesser evil.
Do you think we've learned the right lessons, Steve? Like, seminal moment in world history and in Australia's history. What did it expose about our healthcare system? And do you think we've, improved as a result of that time?
I think we've probably not learned enough. I remember, along with everyone else, thinking maybe a decade ago, how far we've come as a global community in the way we look at healthcare and treatment and organisation of society. And I thought about that in the context of the Spanish flu of 1919 to 22, looking and laughing at border closures in Australia and things like that. Look where we went. How much of that we'd learned, I don't think so. The old adage, those who forget history are bound to repeat it, I think came to pass. I think we've gone backwards in some regards. For example, vaccine refusal. It's always been a problem, but they were very much a very small group. The uneducated, isolated, who respond to positive government programs. But then the highly educated who think that they know better than the experts, who will not do this. And we are seeing an extension of that now because misinformation, rubbish being peddled with a credibility that it doesn't deserve. And this is a worldwide phenomenon. That's just one example. I mean, I saw in Florida, their Surgeon General, their Chief Medical Officer, talking about mandatory vaccination as a form of slavery. And they will pay a price in the months and years ahead when they've got a number of children who die of preventable deaths. So that's just one example of where I don't think we've learned.
And the thing, I think you've nailed it on the head, and it's usually the anti-vax movement in this country and across the West in general. There's a class element to it. And for our listeners, little preview, it ain't the lower classes that become anti-vax. It's usually, as you rightly touched on, people with high levels of education, high levels of income, they've got social status, and they are the ones who are the most vocal and leading the charge when it comes to arguing against science and medicine. From your face-to-face experience, that would be, you would agree with that, disagree with that?
Yeah, no, I do entirely agree with that. And, we've got it such that, for example, the American Secretary of State for Health and Human Services is a rabid anti-vaxxer. It's horrific because that population will suffer terribly as a result. The Centre for Disease Control over there, which is world-renowned for its work in public health, is being emasculated. Ironically, at a time when Australia is about to establish its own Centre for Disease Control. So if we can learn something from the adverse experience of our American friends, that's good. But, education doesn't imply wisdom here, and the ability to critically appraise evidence is one of the things that I harp on the most with medical students and my trainees, because we live in a world now where people have access to all sorts of information without the ability to sort the gold from the rubbish. And they come in to see you, and it's fine if Dr. Google or AI helps them frame the questions. But if they come in with these assertions, some of which really are just unhinged, then how do you deal with that? How do you help them or their loved ones when they're advocating for things that are dangerous?
I think the most important part to this conversation is those who are running the campaign against medicine, science, running down society's response to deal with diseases that afflict people. The victims will be those who least can afford it.
Yeah, and always have been.
So the individuals who can afford for the thing to go pear-shaped and do have the means to save themselves from that, they are the ones who are running the campaign against it, but they are not the ones who are going to wear the full brunt of this. And it's equivalent to, I would say, based on the sort of people you saw in your care during the pandemic, they largely came from a particular socioeconomic background.
Yes, and we know in Melbourne, for example, those who had to work on a face-to-face basis, manual workers who were in the north and west of Melbourne, they were overexposed to the virus compared to those who could comfortably work from home. That's one example, and I think Melbourne got it worse because we are more mobile or more portable a population than, say, Sydney, where geographically you're confined, to particular areas. And look, that's been the case for centuries. The Black Death was a clear example.
That's right.
Where in Europe, if you were in that demographic who were indentured labourers, your mortality rates were about 80 to 90%, whereas it was a third of Europe who died overall. So the nobility were protected.
Yes, that's right.
And that comes back to that idea that, again, I'm very proud of, that in Australia we have a system where it's not perfect, but by world standards we have a system where you can access good health care. And that's my first question as a doctor is, how can I help you? Whereas in other parts of the country, other parts of the world, I should say, it's how will you be paying? And America is a prime example of that. In one city block, you can have world's best health care and people who cannot get basic medicine like penicillin because they can't afford it. They're one of the tens of millions who don't have health coverage, which the current government over there has reduced dramatically coverage of health care. So, those old basics of access to health and education still have to be, I think, the most important aspects of progressive politics if it's to maintain its credibility.
So is that your answer to, because the question in my mind was, what do we do from a public policy perspective? And by the way, it blows my mind what both of you are telling me, that it's actually the upper echelons, educated and rich people who are driving this rejection of medicine. I did not know that. Because that kind of goes against the research I've been reading about misinformation generally, right? So that literature tends to argue that it's the lower information voters who are more susceptible to misinformation, etc., online. But what it sounds like you're saying is that it's actually people who have access to education who might be going down the rabbit holes to do with vaccine rejection. Is that your sense of it, Steve?
I would not be so general. I wouldn't overgeneralise to that extent. You're absolutely right. There are people I grew up with who are well and truly down those rabbit holes, unfortunately, and they didn't go past secondary school, for example. It's just that I think the most vociferous of the anti-establishment groups are the ones who are more educated, more affluent, who feel more empowered to challenge the establishment. And I'm happy for a constructive debate about those sorts of things, but, you're entitled to an opinion. But again, I think expertise matters and you've got to be able to justify those things. And the pseudoscience that are used, again, using Robert Kennedy, he talked about this child he saw at an airport who was mitochondrially challenged. I mean, I almost fell off my chair when I heard that. That is not a medical term. He's not a geneticist. He's talking through an orifice other than his mouth. And, it's just sad and dangerous.
Medical opinion.
That's right.
So, we live in dangerous times, and if we can couch these things in respect and care, then we've got a better chance of getting those outcomes.
That's the important bit.
Yeah.
And that's what we're touching on, Shireen, which is the campaign against medicine is run by the well-off. The individuals who suffer the most are those further down the economic ladder. And yes, many of them do buy into this narrative because, to your point, right? And so but then when everything goes pear-shaped, it's not Robert Kennedy Jr. that's going to be, looking for
he'll have a
assistance.
Scapegoat, I'm sure.
That's right. He's got an escape pod. The person living in downtown Detroit somewhere, basically living under minimum wage is not going to have that.
No.
Right.
And again, little things like the biggest cause of personal bankruptcy in the US, and it used to be here until the mid-70s, was medical bills. You know, we don't want to go there.
That's right.
We don't want to go there.
On that bright and cheerful note, it's been a absolutely enlightening conversation and an important one across a number of important subjects. But thanks for coming and joining us, Stephen.
Thanks, Kos. Thanks, Shireen. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Steve. Really moving conversation. Thank you.
And to our listeners, make sure you follow us on Spotify and Apple. They're the two main platforms if you really are looking for podcasts. We do have a TikTok presence and so on, but make sure you also subscribe to those services to keep yourself up to date with our latest episodes. Cheerio.